Hey everybody, welcome to another week of film history. This week we are covering Citizen Kane. It's a film from 1941, widely considered to be the greatest film of all time. And whether or not it actually is, we can leave that up to you and your blogs. But we are into the 1940s, albeit the early 1940s at this point in film history. There's a lot going on in the 1940s. There's the emergence of world cinema, and we'll take a look at Italian neorealism next week. But there's something going on in Hollywood right around this time, a little bit before and a little bit after, almost until the 1960s, and that is film noir. So film noir is a certain kind of genre that existed during this period in Hollywood, but we're hitting all around what film noir is without actually watching one of the films. So Citizen Kane has a lot of elements that are very similar to film noir. So does which we watched a couple of weeks ago, the German film, but this is a film movement that is specifically in Hollywood, and it would last a few decades. It would be very influential on the aesthetics and storytelling techniques for future films, but we won't watch one of them specifically. That said, it is a fairly substantial, interesting film movement in film history, and it may be something that you want to cover in a final paper. Since it's not something we're covering specifically, it's important to film history, and it may be something that interests you. So if you like the film that we watched this week, Citizen Kane, and you also liked you will probably like film noirs. So do look into that if this film and the previous film were of interest to you. It might be something that you want to dig a little bit deeper in. Also, there's another film that came out in the early 1940s that is also considered to be one of the greatest films of all time, maybe the greatest film of all time, and that is Casablanca. So we won't look at that movie specifically either, but it is certainly worth your time. And it could be another point of interest for you for a potential final paper. Speaking of those final papers, you should get those guidelines within the next couple of weeks. We usually give you the guidelines around the halfway point in the class, and this is now week 6. So we're getting close. It won't be next week, but probably the week after. All right, so this is Orson Welles. He is the director and star of Citizen Kane, and he started as a stage actor, writer, director, and producer. So he started in theater, and he even had his own theater company called the Mercury Theater Company that he founded in 1937. This theater company would produce plays for Broadway, and he would do some innovative things like he would produce Macbeth. That's a Shakespearean play using all African-American actors. So, things that you didn't see too terribly often in the 1930s and early 1940s. So Orson Welles, by the way, the Mercury Theater Company is founded in 1937, right? And Orson Welles is born in 1915, so that makes him 22 years old when he founds this theater company. So very ambitious young person. And a lot of the people from the Mercury Theater Company would star in his films and also play roles in the War of the Worlds broadcast and his other radio broadcasts, but we'll look specifically at War of the Worlds. And during his time in theater, he was courted by Hollywood to come and act or write or direct films, but he continuously turned down these Hollywood studio offers. So he was offered very lucrative contracts, but his heart was with the theater and didn't really see a way that he could innovate in the studio system. So at the same time that he's doing some of his stage plays, he's also producing radio plays. And he produces a series of these things, but one of them becomes very popular and very controversial, and that is the War of the Worlds broadcast. So if you haven't heard of this before, it's this very famous moment in media history where Orson Welles' theater troupe put on a performance of the H.G. Wells book, War of the Worlds, but they do it in a way that sounds like it's produced like a real newscast. So if anyone tuned in kind of in the middle of the broadcast and didn't hear that this was a Mercury Theater Company production and just like clicked it on, there's a lot of performances as news reporters that sound semi-authentic. And the story goes with the War of the Worlds broadcast that people heard this, were convinced that aliens were really landing on Earth, and then chaos ensued. People died from this. People committed suicide, and people protested and marched down the streets with weapons ready to confront the alien menace. That said, these stories are often overstated and exaggerated. And probably the real thing that happened is someone was kind of convinced by the radio play, and then a whole lot of people get their news at this point just via word of mouth. Like a neighbor talks to another neighbor about something that's going on. And something was probably lost in translation between, the person that heard this on the radio and then the person that received it from word of mouth. That said, this did get a lot of controversy. A lot of people felt duped by it, and a lot of people thought it was very creatively ingenious to stage the performance as though these things were happening in real life, and to craft the production around the medium of radio. So it very closely resembled a radio newscast. And from the popularity of War of the Worlds broadcast, RKO, a major Hollywood production company at the time, offers Orson Welles an unprecedented contract. So they offer him two films. He has to produce two films, and he has to produce them within a particular time frame. He didn't meet that time frame at all for his contract, but that was part of his deal. 20% of all of the profits would go to the Mercury Theater. So the Mercury Theater was having some financial issues at the time, and he saw this as a way to kind of bolster his theater company. And then Orson Welles would also get to maintain complete creative control of the films. So RKO would have to come to an agreement with Orson Welles over what the story would be loosely, but Orson Welles has complete creative freedom to cut it the way he wants, to shoot it the way he wants, to use whichever actors he wants to use, and the studios will not interfere. So that's where things are really unprecedented. Before this, we talked briefly about what an auteur was. In the 1930s and 40s, auteurs weren't really a thing at all, right? So the studio dictates who directs, the studio dictates who is the cinematographer, the studio dictates the editor, all of these things. Studios are producing these films. A director basically just exists to work with the actors and get a good performance out of them. So the whole idea of a director being the main creative force behind a film is basically non-existent at this point. So for Orson Welles to be able to do whatever he wants with the films, something completely unheard of. And Welles was determined to make a very good, poignant, important story come to life with his film. And as such, he had several setbacks. He tried to do a few films that just didn't work out, but eventually fell back to Citizen Kane. And that would be the film that he would produce at just 26 years old. And Citizen Kane is certainly an interesting film. It is a fictional film, but it's also kind of based on a real person.
Is it true that when Citizen Kane was being made, that people actually tried to stop it being made? And is it true that Randolph Hearst, the newspaper tycoon, took it as being an attack on himself and tried to stop it when it was made being shown?
To the first part of your question, there was indeed a very definite effort to stop the film during shooting by those elements in the studio who were attempting to seize power, because in those days, studio politics, particularly RKO and indeed many of the big studios in Hollywood, were very much like Central American republics. And there were revolutions and counter-revolutions and every sort of palace intrigue, and there was a big effort to overthrow the then head of the studio, who was taken to be out of his mind because he'd given me this contract, which made the making of these films possible. And stopping me or proving my incompetence would have won their case. Mr. Hearst was quite a bit like Kane, although Kane isn't really founded on Hearst in particular. There are many people sat for it, so to speak, but he was like Kane in that he wouldn't have stooped to such a thing. But he had many hatchet men, editors and representatives of this great network of newspapers all over the country. And to get in good with the chief, there was a good deal of very strong hatchet, including an effort to frame me on a criminal charge, which a policeman was good enough to tell me about. It's sensational and silly and dangerous and gangsterish as that.
Was Mr. Hearst's staff absolutely wrong? I mean, when you say that it was based on that kind of man, was he really stronger in your mind than just being that kind of man?
Well, let me ask you if you think he was libeled.
Well, I don't know him,
I see, yes. Well, do you think that the figure of Kane himself is a deeply unsympathetic figure? In
No.
the Soviet Union, for example, the film has been forbidden general distribution because this important capitalist and newspaper tycoon and anti-social and crypto-fascist figure, etc., to quote all the slogans, is too sympathetic. And for that reason, it's not shown, never has been.
So this is William Randolph Hearst. He is a newspaper tycoon. He was the son of a wealthy senator, so he didn't make his wealth from being a senator, but he was originally like a mining engineer, made millions of dollars, and leveraged those millions of dollars to become a senator. And he only served for a brief period as a senator before dying in 1891. But before he died, he gave his son a newspaper called the San Francisco Examiner in 1887. And then after his death, his mother bought him another newspaper in New York called The Journal in 1895. And that newspaper would be the source of most of his success as a newspaper tycoon.
Let's start simply. Who was William Randolph Hearst?
William Randolph Hearst was the son of a 49er miner who became a millionaire and one of the country's first women philanthropists. And he began as a newspaper publisher, and by the 30s was the most important media magnate, media mogul in the world. He owned newspapers, magazines, newsreel stations, a movie studio, radio stations, a little radio network, and much, much more.
So the Journal was a financially failing newspaper in 1895, but Hearst intended to elevate the Journal into a new tier of popularity. And in doing so, he began a rivalry with another newspaper in New York called The World. William Randolph Hearst is known for basically inventing yellow journalism tactics. If you haven't heard about this before, yellow journalism is basically making up stories. Sometimes the stories exist, but they would make up interviews or interview like the President of the United States. But that interview wouldn't really exist, right? They would just make up what the president said about this particular thing. And because they have this exclusive interview, people would buy their newspapers. It's very underhanded and completely dishonest. But at the time, there was no standard for major news outlets at the time. So he just did whatever he felt like doing. He would also have sensationalist headlines like World at War, right? So you would go and buy that newspaper to find out what is going on if the world is at war, when, maybe the world isn't at war at the time, right? And through these tactics, his newspaper would become incredibly popular and very profitable. Even though he had those profits there, he still had to borrow some money from mom to buy his next newspaper. So he bought a newspaper in Chicago. So his journal would move from New York to Chicago, be in both places. And by 1928, he had a newspaper empire.
I think it's fair to say he's the first media mogul.
What did he own?
Gosh. He owned newspapers and major newspapers in New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Chicago, Pittsburgh, Boston, every major city in the United States except Philadelphia. He made a deal early with Adolph Ochs, the New York Times, who wanted to move to Philadelphia. He owned major magazines all over the world, including Cosmopolitan, which was the most important opinion journal. He owned his own newsreel service. He had a radio network. He had his own news service that competed with the AP and the UPI. He had a feature service. He had a couple of syndicate services. And he owned his own movie studio, which was a very Cosmopolitan Studios, which was in the beginning of the 20th century a major producer of motion pictures.
He had 28 newspapers across the United States. And to give you an idea of what kind of power he wielded with these things, at the time, newspapers were very specific to the locality in which they were produced. So if you're picking up a newspaper in New York, you expect to read most of the news there about what's going on in New York specifically. But because he had newspapers across the entire nation, he could sway public opinion across the entire United States. So if there's a particular issue that he wanted to push, he could push it in all 28 different newspapers to elevate that issue to a national consciousness.
Hearst did not believe in neutral journalism. He believed in advocacy journalism. He wrote his own editorials, and he put them on the front page, and he signed them in big letters. And then he read those editorials on the radio and talked them on his newsreels. So if you bought a Hearst newspaper, there was no way to escape the editorial stance of that newspaper.
He would almost use this power to elevate himself as a Democratic leader for Senate. So he ran for U.S. Senate, but political leader Al Smith rejected his candidacy. And this is a really important moment, right? So at this time, no one had owned so much of the news or so much of media and attempted to do something like get into politics, where he has an ability to elevate issues and then vote on those issues as a member of the United States government. So if you think about how this could be analogous to today, if you think about Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook and the rumors that Mark Zuckerberg may run for president, you may see a huge conflict of interest there. If you are the owner and have the ability to, censor, block things, or elevate certain issues, potentially elevate yourself and diminish your competitors on a platform that reaches the entire country, then you may use that power. You easily could use that power to do just that. And that is a serious issue. And it's an issue that honestly is exploited today, just not to the level that would have been exploited with William Randolph Hearst, and certainly not to the level that would be exploited or could be exploitable if someone like Mark Zuckerberg did actually run for a government office. So because of Al Smith, William Randolph Hearst could not run for U.S. Senate under the Democratic Party. And Hearst was not the best of losers. So he used his newspapers to back opponents to Al Smith, despite agreeing with his politics. So William Randolph Hearst is a Democrat, at the time a Democrat, and so is Al Smith. But because he doesn't like Al Smith, he backs all of his opponents to get him out of office. And likewise, before Citizen Kane was even released, William Randolph Hearst must have had some kind of inkling that the film was actually about him and not going to show him in the nicest light. So he did everything in his power that was legal to diminish Citizen Kane as a film. So he tried to get the film banned from being screened at all. That didn't happen, but in his newspapers, he railed against Orson Welles as a filmmaker and a hack, and also Citizen Kane as being an inconsequential film and a bad film. And it worked to some extent. So Citizen Kane at the time wasn't very popular. Not a lot of people knew about it, honestly. Filmmakers found it very influential, but the general audience didn't really admire it as much as audiences do today. So as you watch the film, you'll see a lot of things that are somewhat innovative in terms of cinematography, in terms of editing and performance, in terms of production design as well. But at least partially due to Hearst's influence, Citizen Kane did not obtain that reputation until later in its life. Now, before we watch the film, I think that it's really important that you at least have a surface understanding of what a newsreel is. We've talked about this in the past. Newsreels have been around since the silent era, but we haven't really looked at one, and a lot of those really old ones are kind of lost to time. So the opening of the film uses this kind of newsreel style, just like War of the Worlds used that radio broadcast style. These newsreels would be around when you went to go see a film, you would see a newsreel with the film. So anyone stepping into Citizen Kane, potentially just a little bit late, may stumble onto what they think is a newsreel, but really it's a way of delivering information to the audience in an interesting and engaging way. But it's really important that you understand the style of a newsreel so that you can understand the context for that newsreel in the actual film. So we're going to take a look at one of those. I'm going to link you in the description to one that I think is at least somewhat similar to the one that we see in Citizen Kane, but at the same time, take a look at it for what's actually going on at the time. So this is only a few years away from Citizen Kane, so we have an idea of what's going on in the world as well. So here's your homework for this week. We're going to take a look at Citizen Kane. Watch that on your choice of streaming services. You need to listen to War of the Worlds broadcast from 1938, put on by the Mercury Theater Company and Orson Welles. And then you also need to watch the newsreel that's linked in the video description. From here, you're going to do another blog post. In this blog, I want you to address the notion that this film, Citizen Kane, is the greatest film of all time. Is that accurate? Why do people think that it's the greatest film of all time? Do you disagree with that sentiment? Why or why not? So fairly simple, straightforward assignment, and you can kind of delve into production design, acting, cinematography, and editing, whichever of those things interest you the most, or whichever of those things you thought stood out the most in Citizen Kane, you can focus on for this blog post. So that's it for this week. Take a look at Citizen Kane. Consider looking into film noir and Casablanca on your own, potentially for a final paper project.